part one of the video entitled The First Cable Ancestor in America followed Caspar Goebel from his induction into the Hessian Army through his capture at the Battle of Trenton, New Jersey, December 26, 1776. While Caspar's experiences are reasonably well known to that point, his movements, activities, and locations over the next 14 years are spotty and full of gaps at best. What we do know is that the same day as his capture, he and his fellow Hessians were ferried across the Delaware River and marched back to Newtown, Pennsylvania, from which Washington's army had embarked the day before for the attack on Trenton, about 15 miles. Many soldiers, including those in the Continental Army, suffered from severe frostbite by the time they arrived. 2 days later, fellow Hessian Johannes Ruber wrote in his diary, quote, "We were confined in a rotten prison consisting of a high wall on each of 4 corners, under an open sky. They poured sea biscuits in a basket through a hole, and we collected it in the snow. It was very cold," unquote. A few days later, they were escorted southwest to Philadelphia and had to march around the streets as part of a victory celebration for the colonists. Ruber wrote, quote, "As we entered the city, all of the people, old and young, assembled to see what kind of men we were. The old women screamed and wanted to strangle us because we had come to America to steal their freedoms. Others brought brandy and bread and wanted to give it to us. The next day, General Washington posted broadsides all over town stating that we were innocent and had not entered the war voluntarily, but had been forced to do so. We should not be regarded as enemies, but should be accepted and treated as friends. Because General Washington gave his word of honor, conditions improved for us," unquote. A week later, they were transferred farther inland to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, because it had several barracks built during the French and Indian War, and because there were lots of farms to provide enough food for them. Ruber again, quote, "We arrived at noon and entered the barracks. We Hessians were in the middle wing, the 900 English prisoners were in the side wings and were watched by the American Guard force, and everything was peaceful and quiet for us. Daily we received 1 pound of bread and as much meat and wood as necessary for cooking and heating, and everything which we needed," unquote. In April 1777, as the weather warmed, many of the Hessian prisoners left their barracks and began to work on the farms in the surrounding countryside. The Lancaster County population at that time consisted of more than 50% German immigrants and is today the center of Pennsylvania Dutch country. Apparently, the Hessians entered into a kind of indentured servitude or paid labor with the families of the area. Ruber wrote, quote, "An American farmer must register with the city commandant as one who wishes to obtain a Hessian to work on his land. Next, he must present a signed declaration that he will honestly return him, or if he has taken him to the English army or allowed him to desert, he must pay a fine of 200 pounds to the city commandant. Also, the farmer shall provide food and drink and pay a wage of 15 pfennigs daily," unquote. Many Hessians escaped from their camps or deserted from the farms in which they worked and simply blended into the surrounding German-speaking villages. They had no doubt been influenced by handbills in German distributed among them, in which the Continental Congress had promised that desertion from the British Army would be to their benefit. They would be given, quote, "the rights, privileges, and immunities of natives as established by these state laws, and that Congress would provide every such person 50 acres of unappropriated lands in some of these states to be held by him and his heirs in absolute perpetuity," unquote. Officers were given even more attractive inducements from 100 to 1,000 acres depending on rank, and still more if they brought deserters with them. All of this without being compelled to serve in the American Army. Toward the end of the war, citizenship was offered as an inducement to desert. There is no evidence that Caspar Goebel deserted to the Americans at this time, or was even paroled from prison camp to work on a surrounding farm. On July 29, 1778, 17 months after his capture, Caspar was among 49 Hessian and Waldeck prisoners marched from Lancaster to Philadelphia under the escort of Lieutenants Van Leer and Stevenson of the 9th Pennsylvania Regiment as part of a prisoner exchange. It indicates he was in Company 3, the Breathour Company of Rawle's regiment. Rawle had died at the Battle of Trenton. It also indicates that he was among about half of the prisoners who show no employer's name or location. It appears Caspar may never have left the prison camp before being exchanged. There are several possible reasons for this, including injury or illness, or he may have been one of 315 Hessian tradesmen, from blacksmiths, carpenters, and wagon makers to shoemakers, butchers, and masons, held back to keep the camps running. In any case, by late 1778, Caspar was back in the British Army with the remnants of Rawls' regiment, and likely on Staten Island, New York, where he had landed in America 2 years earlier. He had rejoined Johannes Ruber, who was also part of a prisoner exchange. Soon they had orders to sail south to occupy Savannah, Georgia. Ruber's diary picks up again on December 13, 1778. Quote, "There arose a whirlwind that made the sea very restless, and our ship was tossed about." Unquote. The ships arrived in Savannah Harbor a week later, and on December 29th, Ruber wrote, quote, "We Hessians and British landed, and the city of Savannah was at once surrounded and stormed from 3 sides. The 2 Hessian regiments made the first assault from the waterfront. We captured a large amount of booty. There was a large amount of indigo, rice, and a supply of salt." Unquote. The Hessians garrisoned at Savannah and later occupied Johns Island just south of Charleston, South Carolina. Johns Island is a barrier island separated from the mainland by the Stono River, which is actually a saltwater channel and part of the Intracoastal Waterway. They camped at a fortification near the Stono Ferry crossing. On June 20th, 1779, the Hessians and British, after their failed attempt to take Charleston, were attacked by the Americans. But Caspar did not participate in the skirmish. He and a companion named Heinrich Feins had deserted, and according to a great-grandson of Caspar's, Millard Fillmore Cable, they set a boat adrift and lay on the bottom while the current carried them noiselessly away from camp. The record grows cold for Caspar as he parted ways with Johannes Ruber for good, who remained a Hessian grenadier to the end of the war. A family story about Caspar joining the Continental Army under General Nathaniel Greene seems widespread and can probably be traced to another of Caspar's great-grandsons, Isaac Doherty, who apparently got his information from Caspar Jr. Caspar's service in the American Army could be true, but there is no record of it, although many records have been lost in courthouse fires. There is an 18-month gap between Caspar's escape from Johns Island and when General Greene took command of the Southern Army, and his whereabouts for that period are unknown in any case. There is circumstantial evidence that he might have fought under General Greene, since the Battle of Guilford Courthouse occurred near the home of his future wife, Elizabeth Baker, on the Uwharrie River in central North Carolina. One account claims that Caspar met her while foraging for food near her home. Caspar finally reappeared with his name, closer to the modern spelling, Caspar Cable, C-A-B-E-L, in the first U.S. Census in 1790 in Wilkes County, North Carolina. How and when his name changed is unknown. He and Elizabeth were likely married about 1781, and they are shown with 5 children. Above them is Elizabeth's mother, the head of a separate household. Her father did not move with them. In the 1800 census, Caspar appears in Ashe County, North Carolina, with his modern spelling and 5 more children. That same year, he purchased 2 tracts of land totaling 150 acres for $300 just across the Tennessee border in Johnson County on Dry Run, a tributary of the Watauga River. There is no evidence that any of his land was in exchange for service in the Continental Army. Caspar and Elizabeth lived on Dry Run until their deaths, his in 1827 and hers after 1850. They are reportedly buried near where the current barn is located, but the exact location is unknown. Caspar Jr., who never married, continued to live in the family home. According to Doherty, they had many slaves, but Caspar's will, written in 1807, makes no mention of slaves. The 1830 census does show a black female living with Caspar's widow Elizabeth and Caspar Jr. The Watauga River was dammed in the early 1940s to form a large reservoir that flooded much of the area, but Caspar's farm narrowly escaped, with the lake's edge coming near the property boundary. The cable house has survived and was remodeled over the years, with parts of the original foundation still visible today. The farm most recently has been owned by the Tester family, but the house now stands abandoned. According to locals, so many cable descendants wanted to stop and see the only remaining gravestone, that of Caspar Jr. that the owners had the marker moved to the nearby John Cable Cemetery along the shore of the lake. Caspar and Elizabeth had 12 children, only 3 of whom were girls. 2 of their sons, Peter and Samuel, were among the earliest settlers in Cades Cove, Tennessee, now part of the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. Samuel moved on, but Peter stayed. John, a son of their brother Benjamin, also moved there after the Civil War. His grist mill, built in 1868, has been restored by the National Park Service, as well as the home of his spinster daughter, Becky Cable. A Cable family tradition says that Becky never forgave her father and refused to marry after her father broke off one of her childhood romances. Cades Cove alone attracts over 2 million visitors per year to the park. The third video in this series will follow the line of Caspar and Elizabeth's son Joseph, who headed into the western frontier of Kentucky.